It is my pleasure first to introduce Shelley, who's going to introduce Linda. Linda, I can't count the number of years we've worked together, but you have influenced me as a person, as a professional for years. And I want to thank you for that. I want to thank you for your vision. I want to thank you for your voice. And you know, I was thinking all the roles that you've had over your career. I want to thank you for your perseverance. I think that's an SEL attribute, isn't it? Somewhere in there, the ability to persevere and to keep focus on what's right and what's good for children. And so it's on that point that I want to hand over the virtual microphone to Shelley, thanking you for that voice and for your perseverance and always keeping those of us who admire and love you so much for keeping us focused on what's best for children of America. Thank you for being part of our conversation today.
Thanks, Maureen. It's been wonderful working with you, and this organization is on such an amazing path for districts in this country. It's an exciting time.
Thank you. And our leader, our inspiration, Shelley Berman.
Well, thank you, Morton. And Linda, thank you. This is going to be very exciting, but I have a great privilege of introducing a person who I consider having had one of the most extensive impacts on education over the last 40 years. You've moved educational research policy forward to improve student results more than any other individual I know. Over those years, Linda has consistently seen the inseparability of academic and social emotional learning. That's been core to much of what your work has shown us. I know I've known Linda since she lent her support to a fledgling organization I happened to found back in the 1980s, entitled Educators for Social Responsibility. And I've admired and appreciated both her thought leadership and her research and policy leadership at Stanford and the Learning Policy Institute. For those who may not be aware, Linda's a professor emeritus at Stanford and the past president of the American Education Research Association. She's authored more than 30 books and 600 other publications. I don't know where you find the time to do that, but it's just extraordinary. And one very important role that Linda has played recently is that she co-chaired the National Commission on Social Emotional Academic Development. And she now serves as the president of the California State Board of Education, which is, I think, an extraordinary role to play in a state that sets the pattern for education, that at one time was the leader in the nation in education. And I hope that you'll be able to move California back into that position again. She recently completed work on a synthesis of new learnings in science and development entitled Design Principles for Schools, which I believe will set the agenda for education reform into the future. As Linda is presenting, if you have questions you'd like to ask, please put them in the chat. And if there's time, we'll address them, some of them at the end. Linda, we are profoundly grateful that you're here with us today to help district leaders take the next steps in effectively implementing social emotional learning. So thank you and welcome.
Thank you, and I'm profoundly grateful to be here. You know, this audience of district leaders is the most important group of people in the country right now for leading in this very difficult time, and, you know, reinventing schools. So it's an extraordinary time. AASA is on the forefront. This group of districts is on the forefront of that activity. So I'm thrilled to be here. I'm going to share my screen and we'll see if our technology works here. You should see my screen now. Is that working? All right. So, you know, you're tackling this very important task of what's a comprehensive approach to social emotional learning. I think of it as creating whole schools for the whole child. You know, social emotional learning is a strong underpinning of whole child development, of academic learning, that it can't just be a single program, you know, a little program on the edge of the school. It has to infuse everything we do. You know, this is a moment as well that everyone recognizes as an opportunity because of the disruption that we've had in this last year to really rethink and reprioritize. These words of a school volunteer and parent in Atlanta really, I think, capture the charge. This is the time to see if something can be different, to reset the system. We have to take a loss, but we can recoup the loss if we actually get kids excited about education and create a more positive space for them to learn. And this, is something that I think educators intrinsically feel and believe, but there are lots of things in the environment, policies and practices that don't necessarily lean in this direction. We've been very active at LPI in trying to really think about restarting and reinventing school. We put out a volume about a year ago about how to reinvent school. There are kind of 10 major features of that work. And we frame it around focusing on authentic learning and equity and harnessing the knowledge of human development, learning, and effective teaching accumulated over the last century and needed for the next. And when we think about this task of reinvention, the school organizations that we have today were largely developed in the early 1900s, between 1900 and about 1920, almost exactly a century ago. They were explicitly modeled on the Henry Ford assembly line, which was the new invention in manufacturing. Put the kids on the conveyor belt, get them on the right belt. They move along from lesson to lesson, teacher to teacher. In middle and high school, they move every 50 minutes to another teacher to get stamped with the lessons that are going to enable them to come out on their different tracks for their different purposes in life. And that really was a very explicit design. It was not a design that was organized around strong relationships between and among adults and children. The old one-room schoolhouse was what they were getting away from, which in fact did try to have those kinds of relationships. And so the principles of that we now know from the science of learning and development were not infused into the school designs that we had then. In fact, one of the goals of that system was to create bureaucracy. In 1890, New York City had only one person in the whole district who was not a teacher. And by 1920, there were hundreds of supervisors and bureaucratic lines of authority and supervision that had been created. Max Weber, who was sort of the father of the theory of bureaucracy, that said that bureaucracy is perfected to the extent that it is dehumanized. The goal was to really make decisions based on rules, not based on individual people. And so we now know a lot about the importance of relationships as we've done a lot of work both in psychological science, learning science, developmental science, and most recently neuroscience. And what we can see in the patterning of the brain really is important. Among the things that we know from the principles of the science of learning and development, which some of us have been trying to synthesize and make available for schools in the design principles that Shelley just talked about, is that relationships are the essential ingredient that catalyzes healthy development and learning. Our brains are always growing. They're always developing. There's no such thing as, sort of a static way of categorizing, people's brains and brain development. They are the function of the experiences that we have and the relationships that we have. And with the right set of experiences and relationships, we can enable all children to have healthy brain and body development and thrive. We also know that children actively construct knowledge by connecting what they know to what they're learning, and they do this within their cultural contexts. We all have different cultural contexts, the way that we experience the world, what we have come to know as the way the world is. And we all learn through connection. We learn through the neural connections, the synapses that are formed in our brain, and we learn by connecting what we're learning to what we already have experienced and know. And so the act of making connections is fundamental to the learning process. Things that we just learn abstractly and memorize and spit back for a test, 90% of those things are gone from our active memory within a short number of months. But things that we actively connect to our experience, that we engage with experientially, are what stick with us. We know that learning is social, emotional, and academic, that we learn much more effectively in a positive emotional state than we learn in a negative emotional state. When we are traumatized, when we are anxious, when we are worried about being stigmatized, when we don't trust the people around us to see us as who we are and treat us well, the anxiety that activates in the brain actually prevents us from learning effectively. When we feel trusting, when we feel emotionally engaged and in a positive way, we learn much more effectively. So, yeah, there's some people who think about social and emotional learning as something that distracts from the time you need for academic learning. In fact, what we know is that social and emotional supports and skills and a positive environment are the pathway to academic learning rather than a distraction from it. Students' perceptions of their own ability influence learning. If I believe that I can be a scientist, if I believe that I will learn to read, that motivates me to put forth the effort and to engage in a way that is positive. If I think I am not good at math, if I think I can't do something, and that's intrinsic to who I am, then I will, in fact, learn less well and perform less well in school. And finally, adversity affects learning. So many of our children have experienced adversity this year. And effective schools must be trauma informed. That is, we need to understand when kids are reflecting the experiences of trauma, which may be in dysregulated behavior of different kinds, how to find out what's going on with them, and then focus on healing rather than using behaviors as an excuse to expand the alienation that a lot of children experience with school. The other thing that's so important is that the most effective antidote to adversity is relationships. Going back to the top of the list, that strong relationships, knowing someone that you can trust and always access, who can be there for you, is what allows us to get through adversity. And so just to sort of remind us of what we know from the studies of the brain, that the development of neural networks is enhanced by rich environments where there are opportunities to experiment with things. Green space, being out of doors, physical activity makes us smarter, ties up those neural networks. Mental activity of various kinds, mindfulness, has a very salutary effect on the development of neural networks, as well as, of course, the opportunity to be calm, to be centered, to be mindful, to be alert, to be attentive. Social interaction develops neural networks. And emotional and cultural well-being, not only feeling emotionally settled, but being culturally affirmed so that one can feel that one is a part of what's going on around us. All those things actually influence our brain activity, make us more intelligent, generally speaking. In addition, we know that the development of neural networks is impaired by stress, particularly toxic stress that is, continuous, anxiety of various kinds, loneliness, the isolation that kids have experienced in many cases this year has been really challenging and detrimental. Sleep disruption, dietary deficiencies, toxins, and identity threats, feeling that who one is in the world is being threatened or stigmatized by those around. As we know, some kids experience a lot more of the experiences in that second column, and others experience a lot more of the advantages in the first column. And part of the role of schools in supporting social and emotional learning and development is to ensure that that left-hand column, as it were, is available to all kids, that we're helping all of them develop the capacity that will allow them to learn. The one simple way of thinking about the biology here is that when we are in a very stressful situation, we produce a lot of cortisol. If it's extreme stress, if it's constant stress, that can become debilitating and have physical as well as mental effects. And we want to reduce the extent to which the experiences in school produce, have kids in that hypercortisolemic environment. It actually produces the hormones the adrenaline, the fight or flight syndrome that affect how kids both behave and how they learn. And we want to create environments in which the children and adults are producing a lot of oxytocin, which is the hormone that we experience when we hug each other, either physically or mentally or spiritually, that allow us to feel safe, and it actually floods the brain with supportive nutrients, if you will, for the learning process. And there's so many things in schools that can either be extremely stressful for some students or extremely healing and supportive. And we need to think about all of those things in building a whole school environment for social and emotional support and learning. As we've been working on this science of learning and development, we've begun to develop these guiding principles for equitable whole school design. There is now on the Learning Policy Institute website, and we've done this with Turnaround for Children and the Sold Alliance, a way of looking at this that includes these 5 areas for us to think about. How do we create a school in which children experience positive developmental relationships, not only in the classroom, but also in the cafeteria and on the playground and on the bus and in all the places that they associate with school? How do we build environments that are filled with safety and belonging? How do we build rich learning experiences that support knowledge development that is meaningful and engaging and motivating? How do we develop the skills, habits, and mindsets, the social, emotional, cognitive skills, habits, and mindsets that will serve kids in becoming good citizens and problem solvers? And how do we create the integrated support systems that make supports readily available to kids? And obviously, how do we do all of this in a way that is culturally affirming, transformative, personalized, and empowering for kids? So I know it's a tall order, but all of you are already down this path and doing this work. So I'm going to take those 5 areas and just say a word about each one of them. When we think about supports for positive developmental relationships, I've already flagged the fact that not all schools are actually designed right now for positive developmental relationships that are continuous and long-term, particularly for kids who do not have a continuous set of relationships in the home or family or community environment. They may have disruptions, certainly in high poverty settings where housing insecurity, employment insecurity, a variety of other health and other issues can disrupt the availability of adults to children. Very important, and we've seen the huge benefits of redesigning school structures so that we have smaller schools or small learning communities within schools with a shared group of adults and kids who get to know each other really well and have multiple ways of interacting. Continuous relationships that are provided by looping, where teachers stay with the same students for more than 1 year, which has a huge effect on both trust and belonging and on academic achievement. Advisory systems are essential in middle and high schools so that there's a place where a family group advised by a teacher who is part of their load, not an add-on, is there for both base touching, social and emotional learning, and academic advisement, connections to parents. I was a high school teacher. You cannot adequately care for 180 children a day and call all their parents and be involved in all of those lives in an intense way as is needed. But you can be an advisor to 15 or 20 students. And if you divide them up among all the teachers or professional adults, that becomes very possible, and be the point person for those kids in touch with those parents, other teachers, and structuring a support system. We've seen, particularly in high need schools, how essential that structure can be for social and emotional support and learning. Block scheduling reduces the number of kids that teachers see at a time. Longer grade spans for schools actually promote achievement. The longer kids are continuously in one place and knowing the people and the patterns and the arrangements, the better their achievement. So there's a lot that we can do structurally. We obviously also in classrooms have to support strong classroom communities help teachers develop and use culturally competent teaching practices and come to know their students well. And that's something I'll come back to for this school year's beginning in particular. Relational trust and collaboration among staff and with families happens when you have teaching teams that share the same group of students and can plan together around them. Planning time and putting money, which we now have from the American Rescue Plan funding, and in many states, the state funding. We can put time for teachers, funded time for teachers to be available for home visits, outreach to parents, positive calls home. It means we have to rethink the way we use time to create that relational base. But we've seen this year how very, very important that is and what the benefits are of getting out of the sort of standardized assembly line way of doing things. So when we think about that second part of the wheel around an environment filled with safety and belonging, we're talking about an environment in which students feel academically accepted, socially accepted, respected academically, and socially, when they are included academically and socially, and they have a sense of relatedness. And that takes real work to create. As you know, it doesn't necessarily happen all by itself. I'll say more about the features of the environment that allow for that. But the fundamental importance of every child having this experience, whether they are a student who is, part of the close-in school community or one who gets bused from further away, whether they are a student with a disability or an English learner or a new immigrant, how we figure out to create and use the time necessary to enable them to feel that they belong is very important. And particularly at the start of this school year, but at the start of every school year, we need to feel comfortable taking the time to establish connections. There's some research that shows that when teachers and students have found 5 connections to each other, we both like baseball, we grew up in the same neighborhood, we both listen to some kind of music that we share, whatever it is, finding the time to help people figure out who each other are, establish those connections between and among students and teachers, that actually establishes a kind of trust, reduces discriminatory discipline, reduces discipline actions in general, gives people a basis on which to relate to each other. So finding the time to establish those connections actually enables that environment of belonging to be established. There's all kinds of games and activities to do that, but that we'd have to take the time to be sure that that's in place. Creating classroom norms with students, having them think through and talk about how do we want to be in relation to each other? What does respect mean for us in this classroom? How can we help each other with our learning? I love to go into classrooms where students have written down the norms and they can remind each other of what they agreed on at the beginning of the year as a basis for their work together. It's going to be very important to hear the stories that children bring with them from their pandemic experiences, from what's going on in their home. There are very different experiences in the pandemic between affluent communities and particularly communities of color and low-income communities where lots of parents have lost employment. There's been a lot of housing insecurity, nutrition insecurity, death and illness that has been at a higher rate. So we need for kids to be able to talk about what they've experienced. We need to have resources at hand for very serious challenges that kids may be experiencing. Having groups that are established with counselors or others to work with kids who have lost family members, for example, to have some group counseling that also builds another set of relatedness and connections may be very, very important. But building that emotional awareness and trust. And if we take a couple of weeks to do that at the beginning of school, it will in the long run benefit academic performance as well. So it's important for us to think about that as a path in, not to just get going with checking through the standards and, marking off the, we've covered standard 2.1.3. Obviously, school climate, which is that part of that environment of safety and belonging, is the foundation for the social and emotional learning. So, experiencing that school is safe with strong relationships and affirmation for all students. A lot of times you have to look around and maybe talk to other educators about each student and say, what do I know about that student? Gee, I haven't figured out anything about that student. What do other people on my team know about that student, or the family, or the teachers from last year, and finding a way for people to give each other information and knowledge. And then, of course, explicit attention to social and emotional learning, which then will be part of what we do with academic learning. I want to just take a minute to say that we have to be very alert to the to disbanding the kind of social identity and stereotype threat that many kids will come into school with. Social identity and stereotype threat are vividly present in society and are often reinforced in school. What is that? It's any kind of identity that any of us holds that is stigmatized in society. It may be around race, it may be around a body image, it may be around language background, it may be around immigration status, it may be around LGBTQI status, it may be around disability or ability status. There are so many things that in the society are marginalized and stigmatized, and kids know that. Even when they're as little as kindergarten, they know when they are carrying the anxiety that they may not be seen and understood for who they are, that they could be stereotyped, they could be bullied, they could be seen as less than. And often, if kids have experienced this over a period of time, they may come in with a chip on their shoulder because they're anticipating that stereotypes will be in the air and that they will be treated in ways that are not, fair to who they really are and what they would like to become. Very important when we're working with kids always to focus if there's an issue on behavior, not on identity, not to say you are this, even things like, you are so selfish or you are so this, but that's not like you. I see that you are having a struggle with the behavior, but we have to be sure too that we're not reinforcing those. So in schools, we do reinforce in many cases a lot of these identity threats, partly by the way in which we segregate kids from each other in tracking systems, in systems that have pull-out classes for students with disabilities or students who are English learners. A lot of redesigned schools are finding ways to create a much more mainstream environment that does not create those obvious divisions. But there's also, of course, the way kids treat each other, as well as the way some educators may unknowingly act on implicit bias. Those threats do create this physical toxic stress condition that trigger that fight or flight reaction. And sometimes you'll see that in, if a kid is asked to, for example, take their hat off and they'll be, overreactive because it's coming on top of a whole lot of other offenses that they've experienced or expectations that they have about how they might be treated. So how do we reduce that kind of social identity and stereotype threat, which we know actually undermines academic performance? We found that it can be reduced by affirmations. In fact, one school we studied, which you'll find on the LPI website, it's called Bronxdale High School in New York, has something called the affirmation station in classrooms. And there are lots of ways by which they're very, very explicit about affirming students' competence, the good things they do. Whenever they do something good, they catch them being good and they affirm them in a variety of ways. Happens to be an inclusion high school with a disproportionate number of students in special education. So there's a lot of ways in which they're very, very explicit about building these integrated classes and affirming behaviors on the part of kids to each other, as well as teachers with kids. We have to have a clear commitment to equal access to high quality curriculum. Kids know when they're getting the good stuff, and they know when they're not getting the good stuff, and they know who's been anointed and who has not been anointed. We have to think about how to build those strong relationships, and then think about cultural competence and all the aspects of the school. What are the materials that kids will encounter? Will they see themselves in the texts and materials, the pictures on the wall, the representations of both in different groups of people and in materials, but also in who comes into the school, who gives talks, how students are treated, how parents are reached out to, what the extracurriculars are, which ones are favored, which ones are given sort of status in the school, and which one, how are kids made, how are they made available to kids without fees, without barriers that again can trigger stereotype threat. That third area of rich learning experiences, we know is around building on students' prior knowledge and cultural experience, giving teachers a lot of tools to know more about what kids can bring, and using lesson strategies that access prior knowledge at the beginning of units and courses and projects, and integrate what kids know, give them agency and voice in that process so that their experience can come in. Relevant and engaging tasks, of course, trigger that social and emotional positivity. Inquiry triggers our brains. We are inquiring species. Human beings have done everything they've done through inquiry. Classrooms that activate inquiry go with our natural form of learning, asking questions, trying to find the answers. Very important for teachers to be able to acknowledge neurodiversity and to offer universal design for learning supports as one way to ensure that kids are feeling socially and emotionally secure, as well as being able to learn. Replacing competition and comparison with collaboration. We need for kids to be, and this goes to grading systems. It goes to how do we give credit for where you are now in your learning, rather than holding you back by the fact that you didn't have as good a start. Kids come in with different levels of experience around any different topics and different skill sets. What we want is, through this process of feedback, reflection, revision, doing things that are engaging, getting feedback on products, and then trying again, we build that growth mindset, we build competence, we build confidence, and then the grading system should recognize the ultimate learning, not the fact that kids were differentially ready or available to that learning at the beginning. And then teaching real cognitive strategies about learning to learn is a big part of social and emotional learning and success. One of the best, most well-researched and successful ways of doing this is through complex instruction. So I've added that little link on the website. It's got a 30-year history of success for collaborative learning in classrooms that is successful for all kinds of learners in these ways. As we embed SEL in academic work, it's not a separate thing. It's a good thing to have a place to teach self-awareness, collaboration skills, to focus on how to learn specific skills. But we can embed social emotional learning in every part of academic work. Projects teach social emotional learning. They teach the planning, organizing, evaluating functions that executive function and metacognition require. And those are among those skills that are so important. Collaborating with and supporting others in projects develops those interpersonal skills, particularly if we guide it in effective ways. Being able to seek resources and overcome barriers, develops emotional skills. And feedback can be used to support social emotional learning. And feedback is a very important skill for educators to learn. We start with acknowledging the positives, what has been accomplished, Recognizing those accomplishments strengthens identity and emotional resilience. Then, identifying areas to improve supports the growth mindset if we give kids the opportunity right away to apply that feedback. And then seeing errors as information to build on supports a sense of safety rather than a sense of fear of making a mistake in the classroom. You're all familiar with the castle wheel, so I won't spend a lot of time on it, but I will note that in addition to those skills of self-awareness and self-management and social awareness and relational skills and decision-making, undergirding those and connected to them are these skills and habits of executive function and perseverance and growth mindset, and the mindsets of belonging and purpose and value of school that have been found to be so important. It's really important that in everything we do, every teacher understands that we are, and every cafeteria worker and every person who drives a bus or engages with kids in any way, any school resource officer understands that these skills need to be explicitly taught and modeled, that we should not assume that kids come in even into high school with all these skills. And if we want them to learn those skills, we need to stop and say, here's a way to do this. Here's how I approach this. Here's another way that we can work on it. And we need to be sure they're never weaponized. We're seeing cases across the country where if a kid does not yet have a well-developed sense of self-regulation, instead of being taught how to develop it, they're being punished for not having it. And so we have to be sure that as we look to develop these skills, we're really clear that they do take explicit teaching and modeling. Some kids will see these skills taught and modeled at home. Others will not, and it's the role of the school then to do that. So the conditions for developing these skills include those regular opportunities throughout the day in every class, as well as a place for explicit teaching. There may be a classroom meeting every day. There may be the advisory space to learn those. We have then guidance to develop perseverance, resilience, agency, those ways in which teachers help kids both organize themselves, to develop executive function. The notebooks that they get taught to use, now it's computer files and folders. But that really helps them then when kids encounter challenges to say, that's okay. We all encounter challenges. How do we problem solve for that? How do we persevere? I find biographies very important for people to read because what you learn when you read biographies in school and outside of school is that every person who's accomplished anything meaningful in the world has encountered failure, has had challenges, has had setbacks, and has had to persevere through them. And I think that helps kids understand that this is, a process of staying focused and persevering, which will pay off for you rather than if I have a problem, I am a failure, I cannot do it, I'm going to give up. And then, of course, educative and restorative behavior supports so that when kids have a challenge, we give them the opportunity to talk about what was behind that behavior, help them find other problem-solving strategies. I love certain tools for teaching social emotional learning, and I'm going back to what Shelley Berman was part of creating back in the 1980s at the Educators for Social Responsibility. I've used these myself. I teach them to my secondary teacher education students at Stanford. But these are terrific tools, conflict resolution in the high school, a whole way to teach kids how to engage with others productively. And I will say that teachers bring in with them whatever they experienced in their childhoods and lives, which was not always a home environment where conflict resolution was skillfully managed. I will say that I did not ever get to see that in my upbringing and needed to learn techniques. And when you can teach in a school common techniques for everyone to use for things like resolving conflicts, then everyone is learning and you get a common base and the level of conflict quickly recedes. School safety, school belonging, school purpose, giving kids an opportunity to reattach and engage in community rebuilding and amends just strengthens that further. The advisory guide is another one, and you can see the kinds of activities they give a whole year's worth for middle and high school students. But it really helps kids think about what they bring to in this particular activity, what they bring positively, the best thing I bring to a group, a personal skill or strength that I bring to working on problems, a contribution I've made to advisory, an attitude that helps me get through difficult situations. And as kids think about these things, they reinforce their own understanding of their capacity. They share it with one another, and you begin to build an affirming approach. We know that SEL programs have long been known to advance academic achievement. This study many of you have seen is the big 200 plus study meta-analysis that found the gains in achievement. And we've had more studies since that show that these effects are long lasting, as well as the personal and character elements that are built. We just this week have a new piece of research that further links academic growth to social emotional learning. Students who demonstrated growth in social emotional learning through explicit SEL teaching, particularly in growth mindset, self-regulation, and academic self-efficacy, showed more growth in academic outcomes. And this was particularly true for students who lived in disadvantaged neighborhoods and for students with disabilities. So again, that explicit teaching of these skills really has wide-ranging effects. The last thing I'll point out is that many of you are working on a variety of approaches to multi-tiered systems of support, integrated support systems for kids. Very important, as in the Comer School Development Program and some others, that all staff share a developmental framework about how kids grow in development and how they should treat kids. And again, this includes the people who are monitoring playground activity. If you have hall monitors or school resource officers, if you have folks on the buses and the cafeterias, all the staff need to understand how we work with children to help them grow and develop, how we address behaviors that may come up, how we continually support a positive belonging attachment, so that the coherent effect of the school is, reinforcing. And then we need readily available interventions. One of the things about our system is that it has so much barrier for kids to get services, whether it's special education services, whether it's services that they need because they've lost housing or they need health care or so on. Figuring out, as community schools often do, how to make these interventions readily available. I've been with a lot of schools, for example, that use reading recovery, which is something that is designed often to be used with first graders or second graders who are struggling in reading, but it can be used at any grade level, and I've used it successfully all the way up to the high school level. But as soon as they see kids, falling behind, not waiting years and years for them to be struggling, they immediately have one-on-one or small group reading support. And you see that within a semester, kids who were far, far behind have caught up to their colleagues, and they're able then to be part of the work going forward. So planning for the kinds of interventions that will be readily available. Again, we have the money to do that right now, and we can think ahead to how that's going to support kids socially and emotionally. And of course, all of this, comes from what I know motivates all of us in education. And I love this framework for the work that John Dewey offered. What the best and wisest parent wants for his or her child, and I'll add grandparent, that must the community want for all of its children. Any other goal is narrow and unlovely. Acted upon, it destroys our democracy. Only by being true to the full growth of all the individuals who make it up can society by any chance be true to itself. I know that's the work that you're doing. I hope you'll be able to think holistically about the ways in which you infuse social and emotional learning and supports in everything you do in the school. We have this new set of design principles for schools that provide resources and examples of all kinds for the blue wheel that I showed you earlier. We're working collaboratively with AASA, with districts that want to really dive deep in this kind of work. And so I look forward to working with many of you in the weeks and months and years to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. Shelley, we need to hear your voice as well.
Oh, sorry. Thank you, Linda. You know, there's such value in the multidimensional perspective that we aren't a linear education system that's focused on academics, that focusing on the whole child and really looking at how we enrich the experiences that are social and emotional, and looking at and planning our social curriculum as carefully as we plan our academic curriculum is absolutely essential. So thank you for sharing that. We have a couple of questions that I thought we might address, and but I would mention that we have put the design principles for schools in the Padlet. So if people want to download it right from the Padlet, and we've also put the link to your website right in the Padlet, so people can just go to there and immediately download and link to the LPI site as well. So maybe I ask the first question is what came up from Maureen Ruby was, what about adults? And how do we take care of adults in this, and your perspective on that?
Well, obviously, adults' wellness, it translates into students' wellness. There's actually a lot of evidence about that. So we need to be developing the capacity of adults to be socially and emotionally solid and aware and mindful and supported, as well as the capacity of kids. And we've seen actually that when you infuse social and emotional learning programs into schools, adults benefit from those as well. But of course, after this pandemic, especially, we're losing a lot of educators, teachers, principals, superintendents, in many cases around the country are saying this has been so stressful. And we've got to start with an acknowledgement of the stress. We've got to allow people to recover and rebuild and renew themselves. We've got to be thinking about how to be supportive in all the ways. We were talking earlier about the fact that in this conference, we don't have the coffee and donuts, which is part of caring for each other, but there's also the ways in which we take the time to find out what people have experienced, what they need, what will be enabling for them, and then also to give them opportunities to learn skills of self-awareness, of mindfulness, centering, of calming, and then not to put teachers in a meat grinder of, you've got to get through this pacing guide at this, pace, and, the kind of anxiety that, particularly during the No Child Left Behind era, folks were feeling. We've, got to acknowledge that their ability to build that classroom environment is partly dependent on our ability as administrators to support them in their colleagueship, in their learning from one another, and in their development of the skills and supports that they need.
Thank you, Linda. Mort?
Linda, years ago, I had the good fortune to study with John Goodlad after he published A Place Called School. And I felt like I was sitting at the feet of the master, as I do often when I talk with you. And I said, John, for so long, I've been following your work and talking with you. I said, and how long will you continue to write what is sounding such commonsensical, so much on target? And he said, I'm going to keep on writing until people start listening. And when I introduced you and talked about perseverance, again, I think that's such an important attribute for all of our work. And yet in today's world, we are being bombarded by critical race theory opposition, by real angry school board meetings, by folks across the country who are voicing strong opposition, including a rising voice against SEL. I'm wondering if you have any John Goodladian advice about how we as colleagues just gather hands and arms and eat donuts and drink coffee together to withstand this storm.
Yeah. You use the term critical race theory, which is being thrown around, a lot in these school board meetings and other things. Most people who use the term don't even really know what it refers to. So I may want to just start by saying, it's a form of legal scholarship that was put forth as a theoretical framework at Harvard Law School some years ago as a way for legal scholars to look at laws and regulations to see how they may intentionally or unintentionally reinforce racial discrimination in the way in which resources are allocated, from slavery through just segregation, through redlining, through the allocation of funds and other things to school districts that then had been segregated, et cetera. So it's a form of legal scholarship. It really has nothing to do with social emotional learning. It's not something that K-12 educators typically teach in school. It's taught in law schools. So just as people hear this term, I think it's important to help folks explain what that is and put that where it belongs in a part of our society that is working on legal redress for laws and policies. In terms of how do we kind of help people think about social and emotional learning around culturally responsive practices, which are part of supporting kids and connecting to them in ways, I think we have to just find the common ground. And I think every parent wants their child to be affirmed in school. They want them to learn to get along. They want them to be engaged and supported to become a whole person. And we have to keep getting back to what the fundamentals are that parents share and glue that brings us together as caretakers of children. It's a dog whistle politics, that's going on with the CRT, the critical race theory conversation. But it's important not to get sucked into that in a way that allows people to conflate things, with each other that are not really related.
So do I have time for one more question?
I don't think so. We have to.
Oh, I'll send Linda the question. Okay, thanks.
All right. Well, Linda, thank you very much for framing and launching us into this summit. We are going to be moving into some very interesting sessions, communities of practice sessions where people in role-like groups will be able to communicate. And it echoes very much of the themes, and we've tried to design this to echo very much of the themes that you've shared already. As I said, the report that you've just issued is in the Padlet. Thank you for your leadership. Thank you for all you've done and for the continual support of this work. And I know that we all are grateful that your presence is here with us and throughout the country. So thank you, Linda.
Thank you. I just want to note that both Shelley and Mort were part of the advisory group that helped produce this report. And I think people will find it very simpatico with the work that they're doing. So I hope it's useful. It's great to see you.
Great. Thanks, Linda.